This skill is called rejecting unreasonable claims based on average statistics. And this skill, just like it sounds, is going to ask you to think about the average or the mean of a set of data. What's interesting about this skill is that it forces us to really think about what average means. Add up all the items and divide by the number of items in the data set. So we're going to look through this question and then look at the statements to see if they are true or if they could be true, and then we'll decide which is the appropriate responses. The scenario created in this example is that a private college advertised that last year their freshman students on average had a score of 1100 on the SAT. Assuming that average refers to the mean, which of the following claims must be true based on this information? So what's important to know is that we can only consider the information being given. It's data being collected last year. For freshman students, they had an average of 1100 on the SAT. And the claims or the statements have to be true, which means if at any point you can create a scenario that wouldn't be true based on the information given, then we would assume that statement to be not true. So we would not mark the box. Their note also below the scenario says more than one statement could be true, and if none of the statements are true, then we mark the appropriate box, which just means that we would mark that none of the statements are true. So we're looking for which statements are true, and more specifically, which statements have to be true no matter the data. So looking at their first statement, it says last year some of the freshman students had a score of 1100 or above on the SAT. When you think about average, add the numbers up, divide by the number of numbers. Some of the freshman students had a score of 1100 or above, and that would have to be true. And we're looking through several examples here. Here you have 5 items in the data set where everybody had where 3 students had an 1100 and 1 student had a 1200. So you have some of the students having an 1100 or above, and you also have 1 student that had 1000, which those 5 numbers then average out to be 1100. So this is a true statement, or an example of a true set of data that would make that statement true. Another possibility would be to have nobody with an 1100 on the SAT, but still have an average of 1100. So I have 2 students scoring 1000 and 2 students scoring a 1200, and those would obviously average to be an 1100, still making that statement true. A third scenario, you could have everybody that scored an 1100, making that statement of 1100 or above a true statement. So for this statement, we would mark true. Moving on to the second statement, remember it has to be true on all possibilities. Their statement is that last year, at least one of the freshman students had a score of exactly 1100 on the SAT. Looking at this first example, you have 2 students with 1000, 1 student with 1100, and 2 students with a 1200. Now, there are obviously lots of possibilities, and this is just a small set of examples, but this would be true. 1 student had exactly an 1100 on the SAT, and the others then average out to 1100 as well. So this would support a true statement here. Looking at the second data set, even though it's a small data set, we're looking at 2 students that scored 1000 and 2 that scored 1200, which would average to our 1100 SAT, but nobody scored an exact 1100. So this scenario causes this statement that last year at least one of the freshman students scored exactly 1100. We can create a scenario where that doesn't necessarily have to be true. And so if this data set actually happened, then this would be a false statement. So we will not mark this to be a true statement because we can create a scenario where it doesn't have to happen based on the data given. Number 3 says next year some of their freshman students had a score of 1100 or above on the SAT. And while this might be a true statement, we don't have any of the data for next year's test scores, so we have to assume that this is a false statement. Or, saying it a different way, we cannot assume this to be a true statement. We don't have enough information for that declaration. So we would not mark number 3 as a true statement. Number 4, last year fewer than half of the freshman students had a score of 1100 or below. So looking at the first one, you have an 800, 1000, an 1100, and 4 1200s on the SAT. This would be a true statement. Here you've got fewer than half. You only have 3 that scored 1100 or below. So that supports the true statement. But below, I've got 2 scenarios that don't support that to be a true statement. I have here 1000, 1100, and 1200. Here, more than half score 1100 or below, and the average is still 1100. So at that point, we would not be able to declare this an always true statement. And going on further, if everyone scored an 1100, then it wouldn't be fewer than half, it would be more than half that scored 1100 or below. And statement number 5 says last year at least one of the freshman students had a score of more than 1200 on the SAT. And as you see here, we have some scenarios where it could be true. So I have at least one student scoring a 1200 and averaging to be an 1100. I have, again, one student scoring an 1100 and averaging to the 1100. This example is a not true statement. At least one of the freshman students scoring more than a 1200 on the SAT. I'm sorry, back up here. At least one student scoring more than 1200. That would be the 1300 that causes that statement to be true. And up here, the 1200 here is that at least one student scoring more than 1200 on the SAT. And honestly, that should be a 1201, and then this would have to back down one to be a 999 for that to be actually a true statement. So here is our example of a true statement. This one is actually not true. We adjust this here. That guy scoring one more, and this one scoring one less. Then this would be an example of not supporting the true statement again. And then here, at least one student scoring more than 1200. All 3 of these guys averaged to 1100, but nobody scored more than a 1200. And then same idea, no one scored more than a 1200, but still an average of 1100. So this one we would not mark as a true statement for multiple reasons. You don't have to come up with lots of reasons that it can't for sure be a true statement. You only need to come up with one scenario where it wouldn't be a true statement, and then you obviously wouldn't mark it as a true statement. And then number 6 says none of the above statements are true, and you obviously would mark that if you could create scenarios for all 5 statements that could make them possibly untrue. So for this particular question, the only one we would mark as it has to be true no matter what the circumstances, it would be statement 1. Last year, some of the students had scored a score of 1100 or above on the SAT.